We got him!
Wild thing, you make my heart sing.
We are talking Wild Thing from 1987, directed by Max Reed, also known as the Asphalt Kid. And this one stars Robert Knepper, who is most notably known for playing bad guys in TV and movies, but here he's playing the protagonist, Wild Thing. You've got Robert Davi playing our bad guy drug dealer, and Catherine Quinlan as Jane, who is our love interest. Now, she's called a character called Jane because this is kind of a remake, so to speak, of Tarzan, or more aptly a kind of reimagining, a 1987 movie which kind of broadly tells the story of a Tarzan-like figure, but in modern day, you know, insert 1987, kind of urban city. Now, the story takes place in the 60s, where we see a hippie couple getting murdered by kind of gangland violence. But they had a young 3-year-old child who manages to escape the gangland violence and is then kind of raised by a kind of a bag lady, a vagrant, who takes care of him until he's around 10. And this bag lady kind of installs him in this anti-authority kind of mindset in him about he shouldn't trust the police and things like this. And then from there, he ultimately kind of lives on the streets and becomes like an urban legend, a vigilante almost, defending these kind of this homeless area from crime and becoming like a kind of a myth to the kind of the locals who live there as the kind of boogeyman who get you if you kind of do wrong and things like this. And then we have Catherine Quinlan's character, who is this kind of social worker who turns up to work at some type of halfway house, and she ends up getting involved and becomes kind of like the love interest. And we found out that Robert Davi's character was one of the people responsible for Wild Thing's parents' deaths, and of course that sort of sets him on a path of revenge. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. This was a VHS favourite of mine back in the day, and it's kind of, as I say, a urban version of kind of a Tarzan mythos with many kind of similar elements here. So if you're a fan of Tarzan, you'll probably enjoy this one to a certain degree. I believe this was filmed in Canada, and it has a kind of Canadian feel, is the best way I would kind of describe it. You see a lot of TV coming out of Canada, and a lot of films are from there because of tax breaks and things, but they almost have a somewhat of a similarity when they tend to be kind of filmed in Canada, and it's true of this one. But what works in this movie's favour, I mean, I think the Wild Thing, although he is kind of a very similar character to Tarzan, I mean, Tarzan's a very famous character for a reason. He's very kind of an interesting character, as is, to a much smaller scale, the Wild Thing character. I think the advantage of this film is because we see him kind of through the ages. We see him as 3, it's very kind of like, innocent and kind of needs help, but still, manages to get away from the drug dealers. And at 10, he's becoming kind of more capable than, he's adult, and he's ultimately now kind of all his life he has lived to kind of like fight and steal and kind of survive and stuff. It makes you feel like you get on that journey with him. And although I don't think Robert Knepper is maybe the best actor in this particular kind of movie, I believe this was his first role. I think he makes for a kind of a likeable kind of hero who has an interesting kind of set of kind of personality traits, because he was brought up by this kind of like this bag lady. He has this kind of anti-authority kind of mindset where he's deathly afraid of like police and kind of like medical professionals and stuff. So you can understand why he's sort of keeping his distance. So I thought that was the writing was kind of reasonable in regards to that. It gives you a realistic idea about how this character is kind of stayed off the radar for kind of so long and things like this. One thing I think is both a positive and a negative, and I'll talk about the positives here, is this movie is very small scale. I mean, this guy, Wild Thing, is really just looking after his neighbourhood, this kind of like this district of this city which is very run down, crime-ridden, lots of kind of homeless people and things like that. So he's not really like this big countrywide hero that everyone knows about. He's just kind of like small scale, relegated to this one particular small area in the city which no one kind of cares about. So it gives it that sort of like, you can imagine there's this urban legend, if that makes sense. You can kind of see how he would kind of fly under the kind of the radar. And another thing I think that goes hand in hand with that, they certainly don't overpower him. The character of Wild Thing, I think, is quite fallible and is relatively kind of like, you know, he doesn't, his challenges aren't stacked too high. Yes, he takes out, you know, lots of people with guns in this movie, and realistically, they would have just killed him. But it doesn't feel too over the top, you know. He doesn't take out too many bad guys and stuff, and he does get wounded and he does fail. He gets captured, he gets shot. So I think that they've made him a fallible kind of hero, but a likeable one at the same time, who has that kind of that outsider kind of feel. Robert Davi, I think, makes a great bad guy. He always does. He's always very kind of like charismatic as a kind of bad guy. There's no kind of different here. You know, and I think it kind of like has this interesting kind of mythology where you really want to see the bad guy kind of get his comeuppance. You really want the kind of the hero to succeed, and it's very much a kind of a swashbuckling kind of film in kind of many ways. And you know, like I said, it's a Tarzan sort of rip-off to a point, but so it's not all that original necessarily, but it's an enjoyable film nonetheless. What doesn't work, I mean, there's a number of things here. I think this movie feels low budget. As I said, it kind of has that Canadian sort of sensibility to it, but for example, the action sequences I feel are very kind of low tech, and they feel like they probably didn't have many takes. They don't feel particularly kind of spectacular. The choreography isn't brilliant. And there's action sequences where, whilst what I was watching as a kid in the 80s might have seemed exciting, watching it now, I think that they're a very kind of low energy and, you know, a little bit kind of silly at times. This movie does have some sillier moments. It's not a movie that you would take necessarily particularly kind of seriously, but there are elements that I think border on the ridiculous. Just one sequence, for example, Catherine Quinnan's character is this social worker, so, you know, she's a relatively smart person, but she's wandering around these dark streets of a night which are crime-ridden and kind of got like gangsters all over the place. But she's chasing a cat in dark alleys, in like abandoned houses, chasing a cat. Why would any sane person do that? Whatever. It's so she can meet Wild Thing. You know, that's how they meet. But you know, it doesn't make sense. No sane person would do that. So there's kind of plenty of like silly little moments that are just there to, you know, move the story needle ultimately, but yeah, you just got to kind of accept that this isn't a particularly kind of realistic movie. Knepper doesn't have a huge amount of dialogue. I think the character's actually quite well written, but he always just feels like he's out of his depth to a certain degree as an actor here. I don't think he can particularly kind of portray the emotive scenes maybe as much as maybe a more experienced actor. This was Knepper's first movie role, as I understand. You know, so it's a little lacking in the kind of the dramatic moments, to be honest with you, and ultimately it's a little bit predictable. But it does kind of feel low budget and kind of low impact maybe for an action film. Certainly, it kind of feels like the bare bones you'd want from kind of like a movie that would be considered an action film. So overall, it's not a bad film. It's a fairly kind of like enjoyable watch if your expectations aren't very high. But ultimately, it's probably not as good as a kind of a mythology as clearly the Tarzan movies. Hence why it's a largely forgotten film. But you know, so to me, it comes across as somewhat of an average movie film for a relatively kind of like low budget movie. But it's not terrible. I think it's worth a watch if you don't mind that kind of vigilante kind of style Tarzan aesthetic. Have you seen Wild Thing? Please do let me know, and if you've seen it, what your thoughts are on it. Look forward to seeing you next time.